Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley.
Not guilty.
Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty.
Not guilty.
Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly.
Guilty.
Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy.
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall.
Not guilty.
Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell.
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez.
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla.
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch.
Not
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.